So welcome everybody. My name is Henriette. I'm one of the organizers of the Feminist Futures Helsinki hackathon, which is running now since last Saturday the 15th until next Monday the 31st. And we're super excited today to have Petra Laiti join us for this, the public series for the hackathon. Petra has a Master of Science in Organizational Leadership from the Department of Economics and Business Administration at Hanken School of Economics. She's been a really vocal figure amongst Sami activists for a number of years now, and she's helped create awareness around Indigenous, of course, specifically Sami land rights, cultural appropriation, and ethical tourism in Sapmi. Petra has served as the chairwoman of the Sámi Youth Association in Finland from 2017 to 2020. And she's also part of Ellos Deatnu, the activist group, who are also a partner in the hackathon. And since 2019, Petra has worked as a political assistant in the Finnish parliament. So today she's going to be talking about Sami perspectives on eco-justice, land rights, and we'll also be reflecting a bit about perhaps the mental models regarding Sami that are prevalent in Finland. And so, as I mentioned in the hackathon, we are partnering with Ellos Deatnu and also actually Snow Change, which is another organization, and we have two teams who are being mentored by Sami activists Pauliina Feodorov and Suna Valkeapää. And in these projects, the teams are discussing how non-Samis can be better allies to the Sami community, as well as how to create spaces for dialogue relating to the climate crisis, spaces that respect a pluriverse of perspectives, but unites people towards common goals of climate action. So that was just to give you a bit of a background also to the hackathon for those of you who are not part of it. And yeah, now I actually just want to give the stage to Petra. So yeah, welcome. We're so happy you're here, and take it away.
Thanks a lot for that introduction. Give me just 2 seconds and I'll share my screen again. Now that we're getting into this topic, hopefully you can see my screen now. You can? Okay, I'll just try and change the slide as well to make sure it's working.
It's not full screen, but we can see it.
It's not? Okay, let me see what I can do. I think that'll work. It doesn't have to be full screen for me, but I'm just making sure that it's visible for you. And I also want to make note to say that I tried to make this font and these color choices as accessible as possible, but if you can't see or if it is inaccessible, please let me know so that I can modify it. And I also want to say before we get started that I don't want to be talking for all of this time. I just want to give you a brief introduction to the ways in which Indigenous people, and in my case, the Sami, might think about certain things and what kind of dimensions we bring to certain discussions. But I do want this to be also a space where you are allowed to ask, you are allowed to say if you don't know something, and I encourage you to be vocal about anything you might not know or understand, or whatever it is that you might want to know more about. Because it is a genuine fact that we need to acknowledge that whenever we are talking about Indigenous issues, we are all more or less ignorant, and you are allowed to be that, and it's not your fault. And so this space is for you to also ask any questions that you might have. So just to get into the topic, today's topic is Indigenous perspectives on eco-justice. Just a short round of introductions. Since we're so many, I would like to encourage you to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat, and also if you have if you have any discussions in the chat while I talk, that's also very welcome and very fine. On my behalf, my name is Petra Laiti, or Mihku Ilmára Mika Petra. My profession is a political assistant at the parliament, as I was introduced. But one of the, I guess, more interesting things, or relevant things rather, about me in regards to this topic is the fact that I've spent my entire life as usually the only Sami in my surrounding community. So I've grown up outside of Sápmi. I'm born there and I've lived some of my years there, but most of my life I've been living outside of Sami territories. And so when I've gone to school, I've always been the only Sami in my class, which means that throughout my life I've been in this sort of middle ground position where I'm constantly explaining my culture to outsiders. And this is what I now do as a career. So what I'm about to tell you is through the lens of someone who attempts to make indigenous worldviews understandable to people who are not grown up in those dimensions. And I try to, through that, make people understand what kinds of dimensions indigenous people bring to different things. And particularly in terms of the climate movement and eco-justice, why this is extremely relevant for us to understand. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so we, before we get into the actual specifics of it all, I do want to just briefly say that we are going to talk a lot about land use. That's going to be the main case topic for today. And that's just because it is the most important dimension for Indigenous people, but it also is all-encompassing. And what I mean by that is when we talk about Indigenous land use, that term in itself is the key to understanding Indigenous dimensions in basically any debate or discussion. What I usually say is when people from majority cultures, when we talk about, and I say we because I am also Finnish, when people in majority cultures, when we talk about land use and we talk about culture, we talk about different aspects of people's lives, we usually compartmentalize those issues as separate entities. So we might think culture is something that is separate from our daily lives. It is perhaps an experience. It's a hobby or an event or something like that. Same with being in touch with nature or what have you. You might own a sailing boat. That might be your hobby. That might be your way of being in touch with your local nature. You might like to jog. That might be your way of being involved with the outdoor life or whatnot. But nonetheless, it is compartmentalized in that it's a separate aspect of your life that does not really interact with the other compartments of your life. Whereas in Indigenous cultures, we see culture as holistic. And what I mean by that is when we talk about Indigenous rights, we usually compartmentalize Indigenous rights according to legislation. So we might talk about land rights or language rights or rights to healthcare, etc. But Indigenous people don't really separate those from each other. To us, the basis of Indigenous culture is land, and upon land, livelihoods are built, livelihoods that uphold structures for the languages that we speak. The land is the place where culture happens. It is where events take place. It is a place for teaching and for learning, etc., etc. And so in any debate, it is very important to understand that this is the Indigenous people's worldview. And so when you bring one dimension of Indigenous lives and culture to any debate or discussion, you inevitably bring all of it. So understanding this worldview, this difference in worldviews is crucial to understanding these different dimensions. So just to go into land use as a case topic, I hope you can all see the map that I made for this presentation. You can see the map of the Nordics, and the red line that you see going through the map, that's basically the border of the Sami lands. So north of that, everything is Sami traditional territories. All around the world, indigenous lands tend to be state-owned. This is due to colonialism and colonialist history. And that means that state policy on land use and how the state has governed and continues to govern state-owned lands highly affects indigenous peoples, making indigenous peoples extremely vulnerable to any actions that a state might take, but also very vulnerable to different political shifts and power shifts and what have you. And so whenever we talk about legislation or indigenous rights or an area where land use is relevant, it is very necessary to look at these policies through the lens of who is missing from these policies. Because oftentimes, I wouldn't say it's always purposeful that indigenous people aren't mentioned, but often it is a symptom of the systemic ignorance that we have. And when indigenous people are not mentioned in these policies, we are basically left out. And so what that means is when the Nordics look at this area of land that you see here, the Nordics might look at this area from different points of view, and from the point of view of legislation from the state perspective. So they might think, okay, border control, very important. We have infrastructure issues. We have forestry, tourism, housing, centralizing public services, etc. And these legal frameworks mostly mention three kinds of rights holders. We have local people, we have non-local people who own local property, and we have visitors or tourists. And I say visitors when I mean basically Finnish people who visit Sami lands, and tourists when I talk about people from abroad. But it's basically, in terms of rights, they're the same category. So from this perspective, local people means anyone who lives permanently are local people. Non-local people who own local property might own different kinds of rights through land ownership or through owning property. And then visitors and tourists might have different rights to difference to locals and property owners. So in this model and this framework, the rights of each person is bound to whatever it is that they own. And then in some cases also for the nearest people among those. So if say your parent owns property in Sami lands, you might also be a property owner rights holder, even though you are not the owner of the property, etc. But when we look at the indigenous dimension here, and the reason I turned this map upside down is for you to look at this landmass from a Sami perspective. So where when you look at the map the right way, you might think, oh, that's far away. But when you look at it from this point of view, it becomes very eminent that the Sami territories are actually a very unified piece of land. And they have a very logical consistency. The places where our cultural centers are basically in the middle of Sami territories and so forth. And then the decisions are made very far away from us. But in these dimensions, when you take Sami, who live in this legislative framework that I just mentioned, the Sami might consider such things as, how do we live and travel and trade through these borders, in spite of these borders? How do we exist so that these borders don't make our lives difficult? How do we have our livelihoods? How do we advance them in spite of the infrastructure and the forestry and the tourism that keeps coming into these lands? How do we find housing in an oversaturated market where the tourism industry boosts the prices higher than the locals can afford? How do we get an education that is fit for us being employed when there are, for instance, no universities or higher education institutes in the Finnish side of Sápmi? So basically, you are forced to leave your home in order to get that education, but how are you then able to return if you can't afford it, etc. And how do we make use of public services when they are hundreds of kilometers away in a language that some of our family members might not speak? So the indigenous struggle in the Nordics stems from the invisibility of indigenous people, but it also is a dimension where indigenous communities are attempting to survive in spite of the legal frameworks that exist for specific areas. So this is what the systemic ignorance basically does to indigenous communities. And when you look at the way the Sami might consider rights holders in this area, you see that these categories become immensely more specific. You have, I'm going to walk you through these. You have a local native, meaning you have a Sami person whose family and whose heritage is in a specific area. Then you have a non-local native, meaning a Sami who lives in Sami territories, but whose heritage belongs to a different area of Sami. Then you might have a non-local native property owner, meaning you might have someone who owns property in a place where their cultural heritage wouldn't actually exist, or but rather their heritage exists in one place, but they own property in another part of Sami territories. Then you have these visiting or returning natives, for instance, people who have been cut off from the lands, who have been born in the south, who might have lost their language, who are returning back to the culture to basically learn where they belong and what their heritage is. Then you have local non-natives, people who are not Sami but who live in these territories permanently. You have non-local, non-native property owners, which is self-evident, and then you have tourists. And according to Sami culture, basically through our worldview, all of these categories have different rights. So when you combine these two dimensions, you have the non-indigenous laws who make very little distinctions between these different groups, versus then the indigenous cultural customs. You can see that there is a fundamentally different way of approaching what rights actually are and where they stem from. So in this Nordic, or shall we say Western worldview, the rights are bound to ownership. But in these indigenous cultural customs, rights are not only bound by a sense of duty and belonging, they are something that you might also inherit as your cultural heritage is something you receive. You also receive the sense of duty and your sense of belonging. You know where you belong. But it is also something that you can reclaim as an indigenous person. Say if you've lost the culture, you've lost the language, it is possible for you to integrate back into the culture and find out where your sense of belonging and your sense of duty is. So it's a lot more fluid, and it's a lot more difficult to define. And it is also a community experience. It's the community that defines that sense of duty and that sense of belonging. So whereas this rights through ownership is very black and white, the indigenous cultural custom has a lot to do with who you are, who you've inherited your background from, but also there is always this dimension of you want to give it to someone else after you. So the sense of duty and the sense of belonging, it's also a sense of duty to your future and not just to your ancestors. Yeah, so in a compartmentalized worldview, as I mentioned earlier, if we look at indigenous land use, you might see different kinds of land use. So compartmentalized, you might think, okay, indigenous people have livelihoods. We have reindeer herding, fishing, hunting, gathering. They have this, we have this system of caretaking and monitoring our traditional lands. We have spiritual customs. We have teaching and learning. We have indigenous medicine, indigenous healing, what have you. But from an indigenous worldview, all of these things are intertwined. So practicing your livelihood can be a method of teaching. Spiritual customs can include caretaking. And so, for instance, this example of fishing is when you fish, you not only thank the river for providing you food, but you also check for pollution. You keep an eye on the fish population. You learn the customs to be able to teach them to someone else. So in an indigenous holistic worldview, it's impossible to separate these dimensions as they are part of a whole. And this is why the discussion on legislation and indigenous rights is incredibly complicated. And it is very difficult to explain to a legislator who is not open to or privy to this sort of worldview, who doesn't understand where all these dimensions are coming from. So we're going to have a small discussion surrounding this this example. This is one of the examples that I've been involved in, and this is a very bare bones way of describing this example, and it's just for sort of awakening your thoughts on this issue. But in the Deatnu River Valley, where I've also been included with the fishing rights struggle, in the river valley, the law recognizes 3 types of rights holders. We have the local people, we have the non-local property owners, and then we have tourists. The law does not take into consideration these indigenous dimensions that I was talking about. And so from a Sami point of view, a local may not be a Sami, and a non-local may not be a tourist. So my sort of introductory question to you to start up this discussion is, what kinds of prohibitions does this bring for the Sami? And I'm going to be monitoring the discussion, so feel free to ask for the floor in the chat. But also, I might want to give the first floor to any of the organizers if you have any comments.
Well, I would like to ask, can you explain a bit more of the question? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Sure, right. So the point of this is just to think about how this legislation makes life for the Sami difficult, basically. So if we take into consideration these indigenous dimensions, where you have these different sorts of, shall we say, senses of duty or senses of belonging, and that defines your rights. Basically, this type of legislation where those types of dimensions are not taken into account, they pose a lot of difficulty for the Sami. So the idea is just to think about what might those difficulties be.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that, you know, if you think about fishing in the river, I'm thinking about the way the Sami would, if they sort of had, let's say, full control or like all the rights, then the way they would be able to maintain the river is very different from now, when they sort of have to fight. And I feel like maybe those efforts, you know, it's very difficult to sort of manage that and to maintain the ecosystems when you constantly have to fight non-local or non-Sami, at least, sort of actors and companies. Yeah, it kind of takes away the holistic approach to the ecosystem. Those are my initial thoughts.
Sure, you hit the nail on the head. It definitely does. Would someone else like to continue?
Well, what comes to my mind, hello, I'm Titti, that what I've understood with the Sami traditions is the thing that you actually don't live in one place your whole life, but you have this kind of circling around the environment. So with that comes to my mind that if you're not like living in that certain area, but your heritage is to know the river and you go there at one time of the year or something like that, that is also something that is not taken in consideration at this.
Yes, you're absolutely right. For instance, I can use my own family as an example of this, where My family, a few generations back, traveled from. We had this concept in Sami culture where we basically have winter homes and summer homes, and that had a lot to do with reindeer herding, basically. But it happened also in other forms of the culture. So my family would have spent their summers in the river valley of Anarjohka, which is one of the branch rivers to Deatnu. And so that is now where the municipality of Otsajohka is, so Utsjoki. But the winter home to that family would have been in Inari, which is a different municipality completely. And so I still have some older relatives who switch between these two municipalities depending on the season. And so the law on Deatnu fishing rights basically states that you have to live in Otsajohka at least 7 months a year in order to be considered a local rights holder. So even though my grandparents and their siblings have lived their entire lives just basically switching between these two homes, they are not considered legal locals unless they move their address to the summer home. So that's one aspect of it for sure. But then when you go even wider, you might think, well, the Sami who are born in Otsajohka or who have a heritage to Inari or to the Deatnu River Valley, they cannot get a higher education than a high school degree in Otsajohka or in the area. So if you want to get a higher education degree, you have to leave. And then basically what happens is young people are forced to choose between getting a higher education degree or be considered a legal rights holder in order to learn the livelihood that they would then need to return to practice. So I have a lot of friends who are doing their studies in one city in the winter and then coming home to Sápmi for the summer, who are not necessarily considered rights holders unless their address would be, their legal address would be in Otsajohka municipality for the entire year or for at least 7 months. So there is this, basically the law quite clearly forces Sami young people to choose between getting a higher education degree and learning traditional livelihoods. And so basically it poses the question that, okay, you would need this higher education degree in order to get a job, say at Otsajohka, but in the Sami traditions, you need both. You need both the livelihood and the degree in order to survive this sort of dual life that we're living now, where we have both these indigenous traditions and these modern jobs. So that's also one aspect of it. Dutti, I saw that you, did you want to say something?
No, just thank you.
Okay. I would like to give the floor to someone else if anyone else has a comment.
Maybe I would like to ask, because I am not entirely sure whether it is question or just, like comment, but wouldn't that mean that, for example, some people could be somehow penalized for using the river?
Yes, and the Sami people, we realized it pretty quickly when this law came into force. So this was in 2017 when the law changed to this, or that was when rather the fishing rights of the Sami were cut down by a lot, and this question became active. And so the Sami instantly understood, okay, we are going to get penalized. We're going to have to basically commit a crime if we want to fish. And after that, after 2017, a lot of people, or not a lot, but like a significant portion of people have been fishing illegally despite the penalties that are in place, basically because knowing that traditional livelihood to us is more valuable. But also, one of the things that has happened since this case took force is the fact that the Sami have actually, there are a couple of Sami who fished illegally and turned themselves into the police and said, I have been fishing illegally and I want to go to court. And they've gone to court. They're currently waiting on permission to go to the highest level of the Finnish court so that they can trial the strength of indigenous rights against this fishing law. And they've already won on a local courts level. So now they're trying directly for the highest level. But basically, the idea behind that court case is to prove that this law that exists now breaks indigenous rights in such a way that it cannot be, what would be the word? That it's not feasible, basically, to have such a law in place, that the law has to respect the Sami indigenous rights. So the penalty question is a real one. And it is a real question for many indigenous communities around the world, where you have to make a choice between committing a crime and practicing your culture. And this is also one of the symptoms of the indigenous invisibility in Nordic legislation, where basically because the Sami have not been consulted, or the Sami have been left out of legislation and policies, and the policies don't take Sami cultural customs into account, the Sami oftentimes are forced to break the law. And this happens all the time, in sometimes very minor ways and sometimes bigger ones, but it is a real problem. And it is one of the mechanisms that basically makes Sami culture all the poorer, because the risk of learning the cultural customs becomes too great. But I think I'm going to switch to my final slide. I have some reflective questions that I was hoping we would discuss. Please feel free to ask of any clarifications. But these are basically some of the discussion questions that I've prepared for us. The first one is rethinking the Nordics, the image of the Nordics. How can you, as a non-Indigenous person, unlearn the image of Sami territories that you've been taught? Second question is, how can we rethink existing structures to stop them from causing harm just by existing? Are there some structures that we can just rethink? Are some impossible to maintain in terms of doing harm to the Sami? And in light of these dimensions, what kind of pitfalls exist for the current climate movement in terms of eco-justice? And I'm also very interested in learning if you learned anything new, something that you didn't even know that you might think about in a certain way, feel free to share. And I'm hoping that perhaps if you will ask for the floor in the chat so that I can keep tabs on who wants to speak. Yes, go ahead, Eva.
Yeah, so I was thinking, at least from the previous example that you explained about fishing, I'm thinking that, you know, if there are policies or agreements within countries or across countries and territories that are made for climate change, and then they're not considering the kind of the holiness of the indigenous cultures, I think then it's very likely that they, you know, actually the steps towards climate action is not effective, because you're hindering like the communities who have most knowledge on how to deal with the climate crisis. So I see the fact that, you know, we might not have a clear image and a clear understanding of what happens as something very dangerous. And at least to the question number one, that is, as a non-Indigenous person, unlearn the image of Sami territories that I've been taught. Well, I didn't grow up in Finland, but I'm thinking that it's like the highest priority is to listen and to learn directly from these communities, because I might assume that if you have an unclear image of that territories, maybe because the person or like the curriculum who taught it to you was not made by the same community, no? So prioritize and amplify and just listen to those voices might be a first step. And maybe, as you said at the beginning, that as a non-Indigenous person, I'm very ignorant of these matters, but it's also it's also important to understand where this ignorance comes from. No, it's a systemic thing that it's maybe sometimes very difficult to get to the information because maybe it's not systematically included in school, or my parents don't tell me about it. So be mindful that it's so systemic that you can also unlearn. And if you put effort and you listen and you're humble and you're ready to have maybe uncomfortable conversations and feel even ashamed or shocked, I think that's probably super necessary to move forward.
Thank you. That was a very, very valuable comment. And definitely, I think the point you made about holiness is a very central one, particularly because I feel like there's a sort of taboo around the topic of holiness and holy lands and holy places. I think for many good reasons, though. Firstly, I think it's none of anyone's business. So what's holy to Indigenous people and why it is that way. But also, I think on some level, quite a few people are aware that the worst type of exotification and like exploitation happens just around these holy places and holy concepts, because there's a lot of like shall we say, toxic interest in Indigenous spirituality, and it's very vulnerable to exploitation. So I feel like people also stay away from that topic out of respect, which in itself is fine. But one of the big issues that I have with the importance of holy places is the fact that if we can't talk about it, we can't really explain what that also means to the Sami. And I think people have just quite a narrow view on what holiness means for Indigenous communities, and like take it as like this given statement that means something very abstract, that this, if we say this land or this river is holy, people might just assume that it's holy for the sake of holiness. But rather, in Indigenous communities, holiness also usually carries with it a lot of practical meaning. It might mean that the river is a source of drinking water, and that it's a source of caretaking and for teaching and for learning. So all of these dimensions come together. And this is also where then that compartmentalization of holiness as a separate thing from everything else does harm to our understanding on Indigenous issues. That a thing can be holy and it can teach us something, and it can be a source of livelihoods, and that's what makes it holy, for instance, or sacred, as many Indigenous people also say. So yeah, it is a very important example of this, sure. Henriette, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I was just curious about tourism, basically, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, kind of, because I guess I see, this struggle between, and maybe this is also an assumption that I have, that kind of the tourism brings a financial benefit to the area that Sami communities also benefit from. But then at the same time, obviously, there are all of these environmental issues, cultural issues, this exotification that you also brought up, and these sacred spaces and how those are invaded by tourism. And we also see in Norway how it's there's this kind of was it like green colonialism, or what the term is, with the windmill parks that are planning to be placed on Sami land, which would disturb the reindeer herders, but it's in the name of green transition. So supposedly that's a good thing, you would think, or at least that's a nice way to sell it. But it's like, how do you kind of what do you think about the tourism and And are there any benefits to Sami people in tourism, or is it sort of altogether more of a downside than a, yeah?
It's a good question. I think I'll try to answer this briefly and then take some other comments as well. But one of the things that combines the Norwegian wind park craze and like the downsides of tourism is the fact that both of them, as you said, have been used to sell itself as a good thing, that the locals are getting something out of it, locals are getting jobs, locals are getting income, and that tourists are upholding services that wouldn't perhaps be there. So for instance, healthcare or law enforcement or whatever. I think what both of those examples are also, or both of those branches are also good examples of, is the fact that since neither of those cases or those examples take the Sami into account from the very beginning, so in legislation basically, people in that industry might often be completely ignorant as to what kind of downsides that might have for the Sami. But it's also a matter of the Sami not being a trusted source on what affects the Sami and how. So if the Sami reindeer herders say, well, our reindeer refuse to go near the wind park, so it actually isolates a lot of land from us that we can't use. Well, in that case, if that knowledge is something that the reindeer herders have had for years and years and years, but it's not legitimized by mostly white academia, for instance, then that knowledge isn't considered knowledge, it's considered an opinion. Same with tourism, where in Inari, for instance, there's a lot of problems with dog sledding, which is an imported form of tourism, or an imported form of service provided to tourists. The Sami have said for years that dog sleds really harm reindeer herding, that they disturb the reindeer, that they frighten the reindeer, and that dog sledding basically highly interferes with the traditional livelihoods of the area. But because there's no research on this, and the legislation is non-existent, and there's only the word of the Sami against the word of the entrepreneurs, well, let's just say oftentimes the official ruling goes with the entrepreneurs, because they are considered a more official rights holder than the Sami. So yeah, but on the subject of tourism, I'd say what really bothers me and what makes me critical of tourism as it is the fact that like in any issue, the systemic ignorance on Sami issues is there as well. So we have the obvious forms where we have exploitation of the culture. We have difficulties where people might not know if they're buying an authentic piece of souvenir or authentic experiences or authentic services or whatnot. So that's an issue in itself. But I also think that people are not necessarily aware of the fact that the Sami have been subject to this mass tourism policy for decades, basically since the Second World War. So for decades and decades and decades, there have been new hotels, there have been new tourist groups, there have been new kinds of charter trips. And the Sami have basically for decades now experienced this phenomenon where every tourist thinks that they're the first one to ever arrive in Sami villages. Every tourist thinks that they're the first ones who want to understand the Sami and want to get to know the culture and want to be like involved with the culture. And everyone thinks that they're the good person, the good guy. And be that as it may, one's intentions might be great, but it is exhausting to be on the receiving end of it, where you just want to like live your life and be at home and be at school and be at work and not be photographed on the way from your house to your working place. And so, for instance, I usually only wear my Sami dresses when I'm up north, but whenever I do so, I do get photographed without my consent. People do come up to me and ask for advice. I've been basically mistaken for a museum guide when I was just visiting one of the places in Inari. And so it's this, it's also a matter of what do these outside entrepreneurs, often non-Sami entrepreneurs, what is it that they tell the tourists about the Sami? What is it that they say? Usually they would say then, or what would happen is that people come with these chartered buses to these villages, and then they basically let the tourists loose for a couple of hours, and then they continue on. So I've had stories where people might grab Sami children to take photos with them. People might wander into our homes and our yards, look inside the window and take photos of people eating. And like everyone thinks that they're not the ones who are doing this. But from a Sami point of view, it's all part of this huge mass of people who just want to experience our culture, but not leave any of the benefits behind. Like I'm very happy to say that I'm very critical of the tourism industry, but that's not to say that you can't travel ethically. But it's just a fact of there isn't really a way of doing that as of now, because there are no means of dialogue between Sami tourism entrepreneurs and legislators and people who are basically ripping the Sami territories off. Yeah, that was a long rant. I hope I answered your question. I see at least one person, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Lubika. I see you have a comment.
Yes, thank you. But I think that you have already somehow like touched it in your answer now, because my comment was about that I came to Finland like 5 years ago without really any knowledge about the Sami culture. And I can only say from the perspective of representativeness that basically for me as a foreigner, the Sami culture is kind of like selling out as something like outdated, something like the folklore, or just, oh, you are coming to Lapland. So yeah, no, we have the Samis there. So really without any understanding towards the Sami's culture and the struggles. So I really learned a lot today from your presentation. Thank you for it. And also like another perspective of this is that very often like we who are coming from the Central Europe, we kind of worship the Nordics for like that they are very ethical and keeping in mind the human rights approach and so on. And for me, this was like really fascinating example how it is not really working well. So also like thank you for an eye-opener.
Great, thank you so much. Glad to hear that this was of help. I've also had a comment asking if I might be a bit more specific on the Sami River case. So basically the question is what the penalties are for the use of the river Deatnu and what caused the policy change in 2017. So just briefly, the policy change in 2017 was made due to this so-called Deatnu agreement, which is a bilateral agreement between Norway and Finland. So these two states came together to negotiate on new fishing restrictions for the Deatnu River. And why that was is that Deatnu runs across the border or it runs along the border for about 100 kilometers or a lot more than that. So it's a common issue for the states of Norway and Finland. And basically what makes the issue difficult is that the Sami, obviously, we don't consider the river a border. We see it as just one valley with the same culture on both sides. We have people are related across the river. We have families, we have schools, we have trade, we have girlfriends and boyfriends and significant others across the border. So it's like a non-border for us, basically. And in many ways, even before there was a road that went alongside the river, the Sami considered that river their road. So all of the social life and all of the happenings that happened back in the day happened on the river. And this was not too long ago. This was only a few decades ago. So it is a matter where two states are coming together to decide on the fate of one valley of indigenous people. And basically what they decided was, in order to, and I quote, protect the salmon, protect the fish in the river, they restricted indigenous fishing rights by 80%, while giving new kinds of rights to tourists and non-local property owners, basically transferring some of Sami rights to people who own property in those lands but are not local. And in this case, as with many others, the law, as I said, does not consider the Sami dimension at all in the rights holders categories. So the rights holders are locals, non-local property owners, and tourists. And the Sami basically might fit all three of these categories, might only fit one, but it just doesn't go like along with our view on how those rights should be given. And as it stands now, the law has been revised a couple of times since then. But if you are caught fishing salmon when you shouldn't be, the penalty for it is 8,000 euros, I guess, per salmon, which is quite a lot. But also when you consider how the selling of the fishing rights changed, is also that when my grandparents, as I said, when they were forced to move their address to their summer home in Otsejohka in order to remain rights holders, they did that because if they would have been keeping up with their tradition of living in one place in the summer and in one place with the winter, which they still do, but just the address has changed. But if they were to just, I say, legally hold on to that tradition, they would have been forced to go from people who have a free right to fish to people who have to pay 300 euros a day for each day that they want to fish. So it is also very much a question of money. And basically this 8,000 euro penalty fee that you might have to pay if you get caught, it hurts these young people the most because it keeps young people from practicing their culture. It makes it incredibly scary to break the law when you do it, even though I know plenty of people who do. And it basically is a mechanism of forcing people out of a livelihood that has sustained that area for thousands of years, basically. And while at the same time giving new kinds of rights to tourists and non-local property owners, which means basically that if you are a Sami, you have just a couple of ways of becoming a rights holder. You can either live all year round in a municipality where you may not have housing or a job, or where you have to travel hours and hours to get to your work. You may have to buy property, which is not cheap in an area where tourists are basically buying up the place. Or you can be a tourist and not be a rights holder in the traditional livelihood of your family. So it does become also a class issue and an economic issue for many young people. So we are at a place where young people may not basically afford to be a part of an indigenous culture as it is legally. So you have this, like, either you have to become wealthy through the means of like Western ways, or you can choose to participate in your culture and risk that fee. I see in the comments that Tutti has a raised hand, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I commented because we had a lecture from Petra Keskitalo, and she was also referring to the tourism side, that there has been value for her family, for a Sami family from that, but definitely there is really a lot history of problematic like exercising. Well, you know, as a Finn born and raised in the south, it's really like there's not a lot of information coming here from the northern part. there was really good book from Kukkaranta, Vastatuuleen, written a few years ago. But I would like to ask about Oddasat, like the national broadcasting company's Sami language news. That how you feel about that, and how you see it as an instrument of getting kind of the knowledge from the north to also the other parts in Finland.
Thank you. I think Oddasat is great. I wish they would have more broadcasting airtime. But I think for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, Oddasat is a pan-Nordic production where each of the Nordic states that have Sami populations participate in the making of a news broadcast. And that happens both in radio, in Sami radio, and then in national TV. And basically they cooperate where they might do different kinds of stories around the Nordics, around the Sami territories in the Nordics, and then construct a TV broadcast. So yeah, I think that's great. I think we should have more of that. And I think honestly, an ideal situation would be that everything regarding the Sami would be done on this pan-Nordic level. We should definitely have one unified Sami parliament for all Nordics, not 4 separate ones. We should definitely have a Nordic standard for Sami legislation and rights. We should definitely have different kinds of panels and expert groups where the dimension that they're working on is Nordic rather than national, because it just the current system just shows the limitations where Finns and Swedes and Norwegians will look at a Sami issue and go, that's far away, and we don't know anything about that. But if we were to have it on a Nordic level, we would know that, okay, we actually have, well, I'm counting Russia out of this picture for the time being. But if we had this like Nordic way of collaborating, we would see that, okay, what we actually have is 3 southern capitals and 1 unified Sami area. And that would be a lot easier for everyone involved, particularly the Nordics who can't seem to do this like on their own nation state type of basis. So of course it would help the Nordics out as well if we could be able to use all of the resources that are available to us instead of just doing everything 3 times. So yeah. I see one question still. I think we are running short on time, but I am going to answer Eva's question just briefly about are there any laws in Finland, Sweden, Norway, or Russia that require Sami representatives? Yes, there is. In Finland, there is a law that requires the government to consult the Sami parliament on anything that might relate to the Sami. The problem is that this is only about the consultation and not taking into account what is said in the consultation. So the state might listen to the Sami on one issue and they say, okay, now we have listened to your opinion and we're going to do this way. So the Sami are not on equal footing by no means. But the land where we have it best in this case is Norway, because Norway has ratified the ILO Convention on Indigenous Rights and Tribal Peoples. But that's not to say that Norway doesn't have issues as well. And where basically the things are the worst would obviously be Russia. But yeah, so that's basically the general gist of it. But in an ideal world, we would have the same people consulting each of these states. But yeah, it's now 7:15. If you have any comments or questions, you can also feel free to message me on social media or send me an email. But other than that, I'm really grateful for the chance of this talk. Thank you to the organizers, and I hope you have an amazing event.
Thank you so much, Petra. And thanks everyone for engaging today. And I think everyone really learned a lot. So yeah, I don't know, Eva, if you have any last words.
I just thank you again, Petra, for your time and sharing, well, all this that you shared, and for people to be here to listen. I hope that our participants in EcoJustice also can take as much of this as possible to their projects. And yeah, looking forward to continuing with these conversations in another moment, in another place, but definitely continuing them. So thank you.